As a nation, I guess we're constantly following and talking about some of the big trends out there. Things like where interest rates are headed, how far house prices are rising and the like. Yet how often do we ignore or perhaps fail to understand the truly important social issues faced by our society? Well, the recently released short film, Polly and Me, aims to shine the spotlight on an increasing trend of child abuse and neglect here in Australia.
Mummy's going to cook you dinner now, Polly. Hot dog and chips. And if you eat it all up, I'll take you to the park.
This girl dreams of a life beyond the walls of her small and dingy apartment, but she's being raised in a dark world by a mother in the grip of heroin addiction and incapable of being a parent, with every day exposed to the destructive forces in her mother's life.
Help me tidy up some of this shit, will you, love?
Mummy, when are you going to take me to the swings?
Let's go tomorrow, babe.
Promise.
Promise. What about the bathroom?
Just a snippet there of this film, which is just the latest in a string of powerful and challenging documentaries on the darker side of Australian life by the award-winning filmmaker Ian Darling. He's also chairman of the Caledonia Foundation, which focuses on the education, training and welfare of disadvantaged young Australians. And Ian joins Peter and I in the studio now. Ian, welcome to Social Business.
Thank you very much.
I guess that girl represents tens of thousands of young kids across Australia. How did this particular film come about?
It came from our experience when we made a documentary about youth homelessness called The Oasis, and what we saw was so many of the kids that we were dealing with had received so much damage in the first 10 years of their lives. So we wanted to go back into the household and get a sense of what life was like for those kids, because we felt that you'll never be able to deal with the problem unless the community actually somehow understands the main issues that are affecting these kids.
Now, Ian, this is a little bit of a departure because most of your work now has been, until now, has been documentary. This is obviously making that as documentaries into a fictional account. Why did you do that?
I think it's strange, Peter, that in many ways the more difficult the subject, the tougher it is to make as a documentary. That the stories we heard were from teenagers, and they were describing what life was like for them for the first 10 years. But also I think you're dealing with such difficult subjects that are around child abuse that if we as a documentary filmmaker came across that, we'd obviously turn the cameras off and report the offenders to the authorities. But the key thing with this is that the stories were real, that everything in this film was from the kids' stories that we'd heard, and so we felt it was docudrama.
Yeah, it was dark and some people would say quite a disturbing portrayal, but it seems very real, and obviously you've taken it from real-life examples. How do you go about getting that balance between, you know, presenting such a dark and disturbing picture, almost shock tactics in some way to raise that issue, but not go so far as to literally see people turn off and say, well, that's just fiction, and don't want to go there?
It is an interesting balance. We certainly didn't intend to shock the audience, but we did want to say that this is real, and if we are going to deal with the problem, we have to almost go to the heart of where the most marginalised problems are. And unfortunately, it is the at-risk communities out there in Australia where we do have the highest incidence of abuse and neglect, and these are the communities that need the greatest help. So we thought, let's tell it as it is. Let's not shy away from it. And if we have the appropriate conversation and provide enough support around it, that we felt that was the way that the community would be able to deal with the problem.
Now, it is obviously a very powerful film, but I presume you just don't want it to be watched and people think, oh, that was powerful. It is a film that I presume is designed to bring about change.
Absolutely. I guess like all our films, with the Oasis documentary, we accompanied it with a major report into youth homelessness, and we got it into every school, and next year we're pleased to say that that'll be on the curriculum in every state and territory in Australia. So a whole generation of school kids will be talking about youth homelessness. This is probably not initially appropriate for the schools, but we did package it up with 10 different NGOs who have partnered with us, and we've had community screenings all around the country where we've been trying to provide solutions. And I think if you've got a film that's as difficult to watch as this, you do need to have a sense of hope. And so these organisations have been putting forward the best practice sort of solutions as to how to help deal with this problem of child abuse and neglect.
How do you go about funding a venture like this?
This was a real community project that we had 12 different philanthropic foundations who funded this film, and they've been working with us along the program with all the different screenings and with engaging with the different NGOs and community partners. And I think that's what needs to happen in these projects. That our next step is actually to get even greater scale, to involve more foundations and more organisations, because when it's such a big problem, you really have to have a whole of community approach. So we thought by getting it at the funding level and at the solution level that it'd be a good start. And it is only a start.
You clearly need those community partners, but if I can ask you a personal question, why does a successful business person such as yourself take this step into a form of community advocacy?
I guess once I'm made aware of something, I feel a real personal need to try and do something about it. And it was during the process of making the documentary on the homelessness I actually realised the extent of the problem. With something like child abuse and neglect, I felt I had a real sense of responsibility once I was made aware of how big the problem was, to actually do something about it and to use the connections I had in the philanthropic community and amongst the charities to actually try and bring them together and just use those existing connections I had, because it's such a big problem. So in many ways, Peter, I guess we're all coming from a very privileged position where we've got roofs over our heads and we're not having that same sense of abuse. So the whole of community actually has to realise that where we can do something, we do have a sense of responsibility. But in this particular instance, it was because I was made aware of it, I felt that I just couldn't not do anything about it.
And in terms of where this film goes now, what are the kind of conversations that you're starting to hear coming out of the film? I guess you have your hopes about what will come out of it, but...
Yeah, well, we had about 500,000 people around Australia watching it last week, and that's a good point for getting a national conversation going. But we're viewing this as many ways as a 20-year approach that we're now, over the course of the next 12 months, trying to get more community partners involved and trying to put a community-based solution towards the government over the course of the next year that highlights the best practice programs around Australia. And there are many. I mean, I think one of the best programs is the Communities for Children program, which the Howard government started and has gone through, that the Rudd-Gillard government continued. That's finding a pocket where the best practice or the strongest player in that community is surrounded by a group of other service providers, and try and get scale in the community, and that's what's required. And I think what we'd like to think is if we were to simply target the 100 most at-risk communities, provide this Communities for Children approach and get more funding from the government and a lot more community participation, it would be a very good first step in trying to deal with this problem.
It's a great vision, Ian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.